This is Breakthrough News, and you are indeed watching the Freedom Side. I am one of your co-hosts, Eugene here alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Colleague. It's been 2 weeks, Rania, so good to be back with you.
It has been 2 weeks because last week was it our nation's birthday?
Yes, America with the triple K. It was its so-called birthday.
Yes, America with the triple K, fascist America founded on slavery. People should go check out the segment we did with Gerald Horton on that the week prior. But it's good to be back, Eugene.
Good. Well, it's good to have you back, and I think our viewers are probably happy to have you back. Just me alone is, of course, not much of a treat. And so thanks to everyone who is here watching. And since many of you are watching on YouTube, I would remind you this is a great opportunity for you to go ahead and hit subscribe. Then go ahead and hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to. So you don't have to look too far for all of the fantastic content coming from us here at Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Colleague. Also want to give a shout out to everybody who is watching here on Free Speech TV. You don't have to do anything, just keep watching. And a big shout out to the whole FSTV crew for making it possible for us to appear to you on your screens vis-a-vis Free Speech TV. Rania, as we get into the show here today, are there other things you would like our viewers to know?
Yes, I want to remind everybody that we are an independent media outlet, an independent nonprofit media outlet, and we are able to bring you the news that corporate media hides or distorts because of the fact that we are independent. And in order to continue to exist and thrive and sustain ourselves, we need your support. So if you are able, become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You help keep us going. You help keep us growing for as little as $5 a month. And you can access exclusive content, including portions of my show, Dispatches, as well as our very cool Breakthrough News merch. This is one of my favorites, this mug. I cherish it and drink out of it every single show. But moreover, I mean, most importantly, it's nice to get merch. It's nice to get access, but it's also really important that you support independent media. It's more important than ever, especially as we're stuck under this two-party dictatorship. I actually have an episode coming out with Eugene per year, which I'm very excited about in the coming days. So keep your eye out for that. And I also encourage everybody who's watching to make sure you not only hit the subscribe button, but smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm.
It does indeed. And yeah, interesting show. Whoever that guy is that you have on that show, hopefully he said something notable and helpful to people. But yes, we got a great show for you here today, as we always do. I can't even encompass everything we have going on here, but obviously the 75th anniversary of NATO. We're going to be talking about the IMF in Africa. We're going to be talking about Hollywood and the Pentagon, the elections in France, obviously the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which, you know, is a story that we can never let go. The presidential elections in Iran. I mean, there's so much happening around the world, the presidential elections in the United States. So we've got a lot for you here today on the show, which means, as regular viewers know, this is a great opportunity for you to let folks know that we are here, youtube.com/Breakthrough News, or if you're watching on Free Speech TV, that you are watching them on Free Speech TV. Text people, knock on their door, air horn out the window, you know, I don't even know, carrier pigeon to someone you know in another state, whatever it takes to let them know that we are here and that we are moving forward the great show, because we want whoever is following you to be following us. And to start the show here, we want to start off with some of the reverberations of what has been taking place in Kenya. Many people have seen, of course, an uprising primarily of the youth against a finance bill that was pushed forward by the IMF. And to get into some of the context around both this specific issue and I think the broader role of the IMF in African economies, we are very, very honored to be joined here once again by Dr. Grieve Shelwa, who's a professor of political economy at the Africa Institute and also a senior fellow at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Grieve, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Hi, Eugene and Rania. A pleasure to be back here.
Well, pleasure is all ours. And, I think a lot of people sort of had heard that the IMF was playing some role in what took place in Kenya in the finance bill and different pieces. And I was hoping you could sort of break down for us, maybe the specific role to the extent that's relevant, but also, why is it that the IMF would be pushing a country like Kenya to inflict pain on its own population when, of course, the way they put everything is that they're trying to help countries develop?
Yeah, that's a great place. That's a great question to ask, Eugene, because ostensibly the IMF is supposed to be a global multilateral agency that is supposed to come to the aid of countries that get themselves into financial problems. And effectively, the IMF is supposed to help get these countries on the road to economic sovereignty, economic self-determination, and to sort of like fully flourish as countries. But that's been anything but what the IMF has done ever since it was established in 1945. In fact, I just looked it up now. Kenya has gone to the IMF 22 times since 1964 when it joined the IMF. And when you work it out, it's like it goes to the IMF on average every 3 years. All right. So it's stuck in this perpetual cycle of always going to the IMF, of always being at the IMF's bidding, which then exposes Kenya to manipulation by the IMF, by the West, and so on and so forth. So you're asking the right question. I mean, it is a strange way to assist a country by inflicting pain on the country's people, particularly the most poor.
And, I guess in Kenya, there was a very well organized effort against this bill, this attempt to institute all these austerity measures. Can you talk a bit about the significance of these protests that were violently suppressed? I mean, hundreds were arrested. And of course, the way the corporate media in the US framed it was that protesters were the ones being violent for unknown reasons.
Yeah, I mean, these are historic protests, Rania. We haven't seen protests like this in Kenya. We haven't seen protests like this in much of Africa. They're incredibly inspiring, incredibly inspirational to many people across the continent. If you go to WhatsApp groups this evening, in fact, as a matter of fact, what happened earlier today, Rania, is that the Kenyan president dismissed his cabinet. He fired his cabinet secretaries precisely because that's the demand that the young people of Kenya have been asking for. So that's one of their demands. The demand one was withdraw the finance bill because it's completely, it's trying to inflict pain on the poor, and it's trying to essentially let go of the multinationals who have a free ride. The very wealthy in Kenya will have a free ride. The global capitalists will have a free ride in Kenya, and yet the poor will have to pick up the bill. So essentially, demand number one, withdraw the finance bill. The president acquiesced. Today, this afternoon, the president acquiesced to demand number two, which is dismiss the cabinet, which has given you this kind of advice that inflicts pain on your own people. So these protests, Rania, are incredibly historic. Exactly that we reverberated across the continent. And you're right, corporate media, especially in the US, was completely wrong to frame the protests as violent. The protests were incredibly peaceful, organized by young people, Gen Z in Kenya, led by women in many cases, incredibly peaceful. And then the police, the state, were the ones that were violent when they tried to repress these particular protests. So exactly, these are incredibly historic, very important protests. We're still trying to make sense of them. And the events are unfolding very quickly. I just illustrated to you this afternoon that the president dismissed his entire cabinet. This is uncharted territory, a victory for these young people, a victory for progressive forces in Kenya, a victory, I think, for progressive forces in Africa.
No, I think that's a very good point. And to me, because it gets so much to the heart of the matter of what's happening here, which is, how can Africa actually develop? How can it move out of poverty? How can it use its resources in different ways? And I think that seems like an important context for this because, so much of what the IMF is prescribing for countries like Kenya or Zambia or Ethiopia or any of the other heavily indebted countries is... tell me if you think I'm wrong, but it seems to be that their prescriptions for how these countries should develop are the opposite of the types of policies that we've seen in countries that have become developed in East Asia, in Europe, and North America. And it feels like a protest movement like this is really sort of bringing that out into the forefront. But anyway, I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's really the undercurrent beneath so much of this is, okay, if the IMF is not the answer, how can countries develop? And well, I'll stop editorializing there.
Yeah, you're right, Eugene. You're very right. I mean, the IMF has been sort of spreading the gospel to Africa, which is a complete opposite of how other countries have developed more recently, in sort of East Asia, South Asia. I mean, China. Even the West, or even I heard you just before this show began, like American development, if one can call that, is steeped in slavery. So we don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But essentially, countries that have developed most recently have done it by capacitating the state, making the state big and present in the economy, and directing the economy by capacitating everyday working people, making sure they have the resources, making sure they have education, they have access to healthcare, making sure they're living decent lives. But the IMF completely gives the opposite type of advice in Africa. And especially, it is very difficult for African sort of governments to resist this, because they have this debt cloud hanging over them, right? So debt is used as a mechanism to control. You are in debt, you have no choice. Therefore, if you want our assistance, you've got to do these things which are going to make your situation even worse. That will make sure that you keep coming back to us, in the way I just illustrated, that Kenya has been going to the IMF, has gone to the IMF 22 times since 1964. I mean, clearly the IMF is doing something wrong here, right? Their job is to make sure that Kenya is on, at least ostensibly, right? Kenya should be on the path to self-determination, and they no longer will need IMF assistance. But they keep going back every 3 years. So you're essentially right, Eugene. I mean, you have to understand it as it is a design. The idea is we're going to, in a way, knock off your knees so that you never run, and therefore you're always going to be, available to us to do our bidding. For example, most people are wondering, what in the world are Kenyan police officers doing in Haiti? Why would Kenyan police officers agree, or why would the Kenyan state agree to send their men and women all the way to Haiti to go and do some nasty things there? Well, when you're at the bidding of the West, and you're at the bidding of the IMF, strange things can happen.
I'm curious, and maybe this is a bit rhetorical, but obviously Africa, one African country after another, has been hollowed out by the IMF over the last several decades. And there's so much evidence that IMF policies in African countries, as well as other global South countries, not only do they not work, they devastate, they starve people. So how is it that in a country like Kenya, you have a government that, despite decades and decades, like half a century practically, of evidence that these policies do so much damage to people across the African continent, how is it you have a government still? I mean, obviously they had to withdraw this particular bill because of the reaction to it, but how is it that Kenya has a government that's willing to still implement these policies?
Yeah, this is incredibly puzzling, Rania, but it has not always been like this. So if you look at African history, for example, from about 1960s, when many African countries got independence, up until the late 70s, mid 80s, there was like a serious project of building self-determination, economic sovereignty. I think we know the heroes and heroines, Thomas Sankara and the rest of them. There was an actual attempt. And I think there was a realization on the part of the West and the IMF that, oh my God, if these guys are actually going to make it, right? And then for some, for many reasons, for some, for some obvious reasons, we ended up getting ourselves into a serious economic crisis in the 80s, mostly engineered by the West, which then loaded our countries with debt. And then we became completely susceptible to IMF influence and interference. But also the IMF and the World Bank were very, very clever. At this point, they began to set up training schools on the African continent, in parts of the global South. They begin to train our economists. They begin to train some of our smartest people, indoctrinating them with this IMF neoliberal ideology. So again, many people today, Rania, who are running ministries of finance or departments of the treasury in African countries are people who are schooled, or they're mostly IMF or World Bank alumni, or have gotten their degrees in economics departments where IMF orthodoxy is taught. They're in a sense brainwashed. And this is the generation that is mostly running African economic finances today. So in a sense, it is not surprising from that point of view. But it was not always like this. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, you would find a different kind of cadre running economic affairs in Africa. Mostly, these are folks who are mostly trained in the Soviet Union, mostly were trained in understanding exactly what it is required to build your economy, what is actually required for you to have economic sovereignty and economic self-determination. But all this was wiped out starting in the 1980s. And this is why we find ourselves in this moment. But it's also important to realize that there is a re-emergence and a resurgence of that kind of thinking. And I think I'd like to draw a through line between that kind of thinking pre-1980s and what's happening in Kenya, for example, today with the young people. They're discovering Thomas Sankara. They're reading classic texts, right? This is the kind of debate and discussion that's happening in all this mobilizing.
No, I think that's an extraordinarily important point. And, it takes me back to another question of whether or not we need to, if this is a moment to start in the world more broadly talking, especially those of us who are here in, the imperial centers, like the United States, to start talking about not just debt relief, but debt forgiveness. I mean, I can remember 1999, 2000, there was a lot of momentum behind it. I mean, in some ways, the beginning of the Iraq War kind of shifted the geopolitical ground there, and we sort of lost the threads of that. But is it time to bring back that kind of conversation? Because it really does feel, when you look at these just odious amounts of debt, relief cannot really do enough. I mean, there has to be serious debt forgiveness, it seems to me.
You're right, Eugene, and I would even go so far as to say I think the terminology should be debt cancellation, because in a sense, forgiveness makes it look like, we brought this upon ourselves. Actually, we didn't. These are unjust debts, as you just rightfully put it. These are unjust debts that in many ways are loaded upon us, sometimes unsuspectingly so, and so on and so forth. So I think this is debt cancellation, because this debt, if this debt doesn't go away, we'll keep on having the conversation in the way that Rania just asked the question a short while ago. So exactly, this is the moment for our sisters and brothers at the Imperial Center to join hands with us and really demand for debt cancellation, and demand for a rewriting of the rules in such a way that we need to have really global multilateral entities that are set up so that we can help one another when times are bad, and rejoice when times are good. But the IMF and World Bank are not fit for that purpose. They're not global institutions. They're really Western institutions doing the West's bidding. So I agree with you entirely, Eugene. We do need to have a conversation about debt cancellation.
Let me just ask you one quick follow-up to that, which I think is notable. Say a little bit more about them being Western institutions, because I think that's another thing is people say, well, aren't they all members of the IMF, all these countries? So isn't it equal in terms of how decision-making is done?
Some countries are more equal than others. So, for example, the IMF is governed by an executive board, which is the board that determines its policy, its lending policy, et cetera, et cetera. That board, and the board supervises the operations of the managing director, who is the person that sort of heads the IMF. That board, one of the most important countries on that board, which has a massive voting share, is the US. So the US can veto. The US has sort of, just like they veto in the Security Council, as we've seen with the genocide in Gaza. People have been wondering, but the UN is ours. It belongs to all of us. How is it that one country has such powerful veto power? How is it that one country can say, no, we veto that resolution, even though that resolution is sensible? The same kind of stuff happens in the IMF. The same kind of stuff happens in the World Bank. In fact, I'll say one more thing, Eugene. There is a gentleman's agreement. The gentleman's agreement, because it's men who agreed in the 1940s when the IMF and World Bank were being set up, that the head of the IMF will be selected by Europe, and the head of the World Bank will be selected by the US. If these are truly global institutions where we are all equal members, why would you want to have a monopoly on who heads it? So all this tells you that these are essentially political institutions, and they've been set up to do the bidding of the US and its friends in Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, we really appreciate you helping us sort through all of this. Dr. Grieve Chelwa from the Africa Institute and the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, the IMF and World Bank have created so much devastation and loss around the world in the most disgusting ways. And, they're obvious, institutions of neocolonialism. And it's just amazing to me that they are still able to manage to, through like these sort of US client governments in these various countries, implement their policies, despite the fact that, they don't work. They do work, I guess, if you're talking about lining the pockets of the wealthiest people in the world.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. It's working correctly from what it's supposed to be doing, but it's not working from the point of view of what we're all told they're supposed to be doing. And that in and of itself is sort of the propaganda effect, as it regards these institutions. But, Grieve is doing some excellent work on this piece. He had a piece that I wish I could remember exactly what publication it was in. I hope people check out from a couple months ago where he broke down, maybe it was actually in Tricon, but he broke down very expertly how unbelievably false the IMF prescriptions are for growth and development when you actually put it in historical perspective of countries that have recently had significant growth and development. So very, very worth checking out there. Well, we're going to move the show forward here to another very big, I would say, somewhat unexpected issue. That was the French elections that kind of shocked the world based on what we were told was going to happen, that the far right was going to dominate. That did not happen, as the new Popular Front coalition coming from the left actually won the most seats, and the right-wing surge didn't materialize in the way many people thought it would. So we are very, very honored to be joined for this show by the French deputy Danielle Obono, who is from La France Insoumise and also the new Popular Front coalition. Danielle, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's really an honor to have you here. We were excited to see you on the stage on Sunday during the celebrations and everything that was happening there. And let me just start here, maybe. I think the whole world was saying National Rally, Le Pen is going to win, they're going to dominate, and then it comes around and the new Popular Front has the most seats. What do you think it was? What was the appeal, the issues you all put forward that you think allowed you to win the most seats and blunt the impact of this far-right surge?
Yes, the entire media establishment and political, pundits had been waiting for the far right to win, and it's been in the making for the past decades, actually, because as you know, it didn't happen just on Sunday or the moment Macron decided to do this snap election. The rise of the far right in France is rooted with the economic crisis, the social crisis, the years of neoliberal policies, and the structural racism that shapes our entire society. So they've been doing the national rally work over the past year. I mean, the Macron government implementing antisocial policies, pushing, an anti-climate agenda, and also attacking civil liberties and using and weaponizing Islamophobia in order to divide the social movement and the society. And I think what happened is that everybody predicted that the far right will win big at the European election, and we were prepared to that. They had won 5 years ago, so that was not the surprise. The surprise was when Emmanuel Macron decided to dissolve the National Assembly and to call for this election, and people realized that it was ready to give them power because they just had won. They had just came first at the European election, and it was just saying that, okay, let them take the country. And I think there was a huge movement. People were both afraid because the far right and the prospect of the far right winning meant risking their lives. I mean, livelihood, but also lives. There was a lot of people who feared for their lives. There are a lot of parents calling their kids saying that if they win, you have to leave this country. Although you're born here, you get everything here, but you have to leave. And I think it was very something physical. There were groups of far right groups who were roaming the street looking for LGBT people to beat up. Literally, that's what they said when they got arrested. So I think there was a lot of fear millions of people, but also anger against Macron, who kind of gambled our lives just for some political, mind game with the far right, and because people were already very angry against him over the past 5 years, we've witnessed and took part in huge social movements against Macron, against his policies. So you got everything. I think that's what made it so powerful, even though it was a very short campaign, only 3 weeks. We got so many people who came and said, okay, now what can I do? How can I help? A huge support, and I think that's really the people rising against the far right, also, and against Macron game. And to beat the odds and say, no, you won't, not today, not today, this won't happen. And that's how we did it, I think.
It's really incredible, especially because it was so unexpected. But then now you have a situation where it's unclear whether your leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, will actually get to be prime minister because of what they call the centrists and their unwillingness to form a coalition with him. And so I'm confused here because these are the centrists who are always saying that the far right is fascist and we can't let them win and we have to defeat them. Yet when it comes down to it, they clearly have more of a problem with the left than they do with the far right, which I guess shouldn't surprise us on this show. But the other thing is I of course saw the way that the corporate media in the English-speaking corporate media was framing Mélenchon as this like anti-Semitic radical, is how he was described by Reuters. So they're really, really opening with the issue of Palestine because his politics on Palestine are good as far as I'm concerned, but not as far as the center is concerned. So can you explain what the obstacles are now to forming a coalition that would actually see the left take the premiership?
Yes, I mean, basically the main obstacle is Macron himself, because he's trying to pull something like a power grab. I mean, if anything that is happening in France was happening anywhere else outside the world, around the world, especially in an African country or in a Southern American country, you would have the entire media talking down on the people of those countries and saying how this can happen. This is the president should respect democracy and so on and so forth. But because it's France, a European country, Western country, there's no such talk. But I mean, the situation is pretty much him trying to trample the democratic results because of the Fifth Republic system. So what should have happened is he should have called us and said, okay, you won the election. So I'm asking you to who do you want as a prime minister? And I'm asking you to form the government. That's how he should have done. But right now he's using he's trying to win some time, and especially because we have the Olympic Games happening in like 2 weeks, and in order to keep the things running, with the so-called technical government, and trying to not actually respect the result of the election, and he's really trying a power grab and saying that who cares? He's the one who had called those elections. He got beat because his candidates got only second place, and still he doesn't recognize the results of the election. So this is practically the last authoritarian move that he made. He's made a lot of them over the past 7 years, but he's basically saying that I don't care, and I will keep going, and I will just do whatever I want, which we won't let happen, of course. And there's already call for demonstration and stuff like that, and that's what we're building actually.
No, I think that's important to hear, and I think the social movements, if you've mentioned, have been so huge in this conversation. And one of which, and Rania alluded to this, is of course the movement in solidarity with Palestine that especially La France Insoumise has been very closely associated with. I mean, after the first round of the elections, all the Israeli ministers were all celebrating, saying, "Oh, look at this, national rally is coming first." It shows that Palestine, people in France don't care about Palestine. But now, after seeing the second round, it seems clear to me that, having a morally correct position on the genocide in Gaza was inspirational to a lot of people. So talk about that, if you could, just the role of that issue, the Gaza issue, in terms of helping build support for many people who came out and voted for the Popular Front in this election.
Yes, that's been something very powerful happening, because over the past 7 months, when we started to mobilize against the genocide still ongoing in Gaza, we actually built a deeply rooted movement, because we were at the start among the very few, and I would say the only political organization that basically said we condemn, the crimes committed on October the 7th, and we condemned the response by the Israeli government, and we've been, we never back down on that, and we say that we need ceasefire now, and we need to do everything we can to stop what is happening, what is being labeled as plausible genocide, and we never back down on that. So we've been attacked by the media. We've been called every names on books, especially anti-Semite, pro-Hamas. The deal, and it was not easy, because for a long time there was only a few of us doing that. But what happened also for millions of people in the country, and I think it's true for people around the world, because what we've seen is like the people around the world are supporting Palestinian people, and especially in Western Europe and in the Western world, there's this discrepancy between the position of the governments and the position of the people who are, no matter the nationality, the religion, the ethnicity, they support, I think in their overwhelming majority, the people of Palestine and the demand for a ceasefire. And I think that's why there was such a big support for us, because we were the only ones standing strong on our values and principles and in support of Palestine. And what also happened, because it was, we were at the beginning of the European elections, and we got the deep honor to have as a candidate Rima Hassan, who is a Palestinian refugee, actually, because she was born in a refugee camp in Syria, and she was one of a candidate, and she decided to stand for the European elections, and she became the spokesperson in a way of this fight. She's very brave. She's been targeted viciously by, that went very, very far, and as you may know, and it's been happening over the world. But at the same time, I think that's what earned a lot of respect from the people and a lot of love. There was so much love, and people felt so grateful that they had people standing for them in the media, and no matter what. And I think that was for the past month, that was we build on that, and that's helped also for the election, because we already had this massive support within working class people, and that really built a lot of proximity and a lot of community around us that helped during the snap legislative election.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, please go ahead, Rania.
Well, I was just going to really quickly ask before we wrap up here is, as we, as obviously the fight isn't over, But I think that this did take a lot of people by surprise. This was a victory for the left in France, regardless of what happens next. So what are the lessons, or do you think there are lessons that others, especially in European countries, can take from what the left managed to accomplish in this election in France?
Yes, the fight is only starting. Actually, we won the first one of the rounds, but they had a lot of advance and they are still held by the entire system. So I think we're still also learning. We've learned from over left organization all over the world. I mean, when I say we, the La France Insoumise especially, we've learned from what happened in the US. To build a platform, to build our own organization. We've learned what happened in the UK. We learned from Latin American countries. So we learned from all those movements all around the world. What I think is very important and helped us over the past years is to have our own movement, our own independent platform, and also what is central for us, it's our program, our political platform. That's the key, and to not be ashamed to be radical and to say, I mean, people are asking for radical, concrete measures to change their lives, and I think that's something we keep repeating. We are elected to realize a program, to put in place concrete measure to change people's lives. So we want to tax the rich. We want to recognize the state of Palestine, and we will do that, and so on and so forth. So I think for me, the key is your movement, to have a big movement. And nowadays we are the biggest left movement. And I think political organization on the left, because we built this for the past years, and I would say keep pushing for bold and concrete measures that actually the people need and want to be put in place. And when they believe that you will do that, they go out and vote. And yeah, I would say among the things we've managed to do and that helped us to get this result, those are two of them.
Well, extremely important. I think all around the world, it was a nice jolt of excitement and hope. And I think you're right. The fight is just beginning, and we've got a good head of steam here. Deputy Danielle Obono from La France Insoumise, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Eugene, it always amazes me, and it shouldn't amaze me because we have so much historical precedent for this, but the way the center would rather help fascists than ever actually align with the left on almost anything.
No, I mean, even in the second round, Macron was trying to stop some of his candidates who got third from dropping out so that people wouldn't vote for the new Popular Front because, he said that they're just as bad or whatever it may be. And we'll see what kind of games they play now. But yeah, it really is. It's a mask off moment. And it's also one, I'll say this before we go to our next guest, that's worth looking into. And I'm actually trying to write something about this that we'll have out soon. That, the big business in France all was for Le Pen in the National Rally because they realized Macron couldn't succeed in the second round. And so they all started going out and supporting them. There's articles in the Financial Times, France 24, other places you can see where all the biggest capitalists and business people, they'd rather have fascism than the left, which is, an interesting replay of history because the same thing happened in the 1930s in France too. But that's a whole other story for a whole other time. Now we want to move to another very important element of our society here in the United States, Rania, and that is I don't know if infiltration is even the right word, the marriage between Hollywood and the Pentagon in terms of how our views are being manipulated through that relationship. And we are very, very honored to be joined here for this conversation by Dr. Roger Stahl, who's the University of Georgia, the head of the communications department at the University of Georgia, and also the author of Militiatainment, Inc., and the director of Theaters of War. Dr. Stahl, thanks so much for being with us. Well, it's great to have you here. And I guess maybe I'll just start by asking, how pervasive is the sort of role of the Pentagon in working with Hollywood? I mean, I know we all see the TV shows, we see the movies, you see the military stuff in there. So does that mean every time you see a plane that the Pentagon's involved? I mean, how deep is this issue?
Scholars really didn't have a sense of this until about 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, people like myself that have studied this kind of thing for 15 years, 20 years. And so, we had the same idea that, the average person on an airplane next to me had, which is, maybe a few dozen films were supported by the U.S. military, and they got some toys, and in exchange there might have been a quid pro quo of some kind. But press accounts were limited, and so we thought maybe 100, 150 films might have been subjected to some kind of cooperative relationship. But we got our hands on about 60,000 pages of internal documents. And we're able to kind of methodically go through them and catalog all the films that have been under contractual relationship with the U.S. military. And since World War II, that's about 2,500. And if you add up all of the episodes, the televised episodes of those kinds of cooperative relationships, shows like NCIS, where the Navy oversees every single episode and goes through every single script, then we're up into the 10,000s.
And, it amazes me because it goes so deep. I mean, sometimes we just think about the fact that, okay, so you end up getting these kinds of like advertisements in a lot of movies of various U.S. weapon systems, of all these like military toys and how cool they are, even some that don't actually work that well in real life. But then there's this aspect of it where it's like in order for these movies to be able to access these weapons to use in their movies, they have to let the Pentagon approve their scripts. Can you talk a little bit about what that means exactly? Because it's pretty shocking.
Yeah, the process is weird, and it was opaque until pretty recently. I mean, basically, there are things that look really good on screen that add production value and add a sense of realism, and so that's installations, weapons, and personnel that can be loaned out by the U.S. military, and filmmakers pay a modest fee. It's really quite low, so that the Pentagon maintains maximum leverage over the production. And so, usually the filmmaker comes to the military and says, "I got a script for you. We have a wish list. Could you provide these things?" And then it starts going through that approval process. And so the folks at the entertainment liaison offices at the various branches, they'll have a look. They come through. And they come back with 3 or 4 pages of changes that they want to make, and about 80% of those, 85% of those are technical in nature, and you and I probably wouldn't object to them. They might have to do with national security interests as well. But, it's like this badge goes over here, and they wouldn't address this particular subordinate in this way. But about 15 to 20%, they're ideological, political. They have direct bearing on public controversies that you and I would care a lot about. And those are the changes that I'm really interested in. And that's why the office exists. I mean, they say they exist to promote accuracy, and that's true to an extent. But they're really there to kind of put the right narratives on screen and the right kinds of images that will sustain the institution and sustain U.S. foreign policy. So if the film or the television show is approved, then the producer gets the stuff, they make the film under contract, and the military gets one final, and this is usually written into the contract, one final screening where they make sure everything that they had agreed to is in there. And that's a rough draft, and then the film is finished. And sometimes after that, if the military really wants to get involved in the publicity of the film, it does. So it sort of rolls out, if you're the Navy, it rolls out the blue carpet and they have an event. It's a public screening or some celebration of the military that goes along with that. So there might even be something after the film is released. You saw a lot of that with Top Gun Maverick, for example.
Yeah, no, very good point. I remember Captain Marvel when that came out, the Air Force did a whole, thing around it. And I guess one of the questions I have is, what do we know about the roots of this office? I mean, I'm sure it goes back some time to some degree. Obviously, they've been making military movies for a long time. But I mean, was this sort of a conscious thing that the Pentagon created this in order to shape our views, or something that just sort of developed over the years by halves?
It goes all the way back to the birth of film. I mean, the Army participated in Birth of a Nation. This is the first major feature-length film.
Wow.
As a really ignominious place in film history because of that. Because on the one hand, it was the first major feature-length film. It's not the silent era, but it also gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan, and the Army was involved in that, in shaping that story. So it goes all the way back to the beginning of film, but the office itself was established formally when the permanent military establishment was formed in the post-war period. So this is 1949, when we get, the Pentagon as a building. It's a permanent military establishment now. It's not just called up for the wars that we need to fight. And a film office comes along with that. So, its mission has evolved since then. They've kind of tweaked it. There have been various controversies along the way, but it stayed pretty consistent since the 1940s.
Yeah, it's pretty stunning. Like, just in general, I mean, I think about all the movies I've seen. Eugene's going to make fun of me for this, but I like Marvel movies. I'm a big fan. But yeah, you see all the military propaganda in it, and I, of course, know how to see through it. But for most Americans who aren't, involved in journalism or constantly watching foreign policy play out the way we might, they have no idea. So can you explain? I mean, some people might be saying, so what? Like, yeah, okay, fine. So what that, like, the Pentagon's throwing in some other weapons in some movie? It's just a movie. It's a fiction movie. Who cares? What's the big problem here? So I know that seems like a silly question, but some might ask, like, what's the danger? Why is this so problematic?
Well, it's a great question. What are the stakes? Like, if you look at this as an institution of public relations, of censorship, of propaganda, then you can immediately start thinking about the ramifications of doing business like this. And you're right. It's not for people like maybe you and I that spend our lives thinking about foreign policy, but the rest of the world and the rest of the United States, those people who vote on, say, a weapons appropriations bill, or the senator that's going to vote for that, those people that have to have their consent before the United States goes off on a military adventure somewhere in the world, those voters are going to be shaped by their media environment. What's the most powerful force in that environment? And the military figured this out very quickly, that it's not presidential speeches, it's not debates on the House floor, it's not policy wonk stuff. It is representations of the military at home and overseas and what they're doing. And if you can create a powerful narrative system that reinforces the idea that U.S. military activity around the world mainly works out for the best, and it's got noble intentions behind it, then you're halfway there to reaching that critical threshold that it takes to authorize a conflict like Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or what have you. And it's not just foreign policy, it's selling weapons, it's tamping down criticism of the military in terms of maybe its internal problems with racism or sexual assault. And we can go down the list of the things that the office is really worried about and the kinds of things they'll take out of scripts. But that's it in a nutshell.
Well, that's an amazing issue. I want to follow up on that really quickly. Maybe you were just referencing it. Interesting, but there's been such a controversy around the epidemic of sexual assaults in the military, and there have been so many people, trying to speak up against this. And this is something that they would potentially say, tweak this in your script.
Oh, certainly. It's a huge priority for them. In fact, it's one of the things I told you before, that filmmakers come to the military and they bring their scripts. Well, if you're in a long-term relationship with the Navy, like NCIS is, and all the derivatives of NCIS, that's a good place for the Navy because they've got a long and sordid history of sexual harassment and assault that they're trying to remediate, going all the way back to the early 90s in the tailhook scandal. That's a good place to put those messages. And if the problem is that multiple sailors are harassing subordinates, and mainly females, and the upper administration is not listening to those complaints. And in fact, those people who lodge those complaints are being punished for it. Then you got to turn that story around. What NCIS did, what the Navy did, was approach them and say, hey, how about a story where the problem isn't that, people are being punished for complaining about sexual assault? How about the problem is they clam up and they don't want to talk about it? And so, the Navy did a series of episodes about this where, the person who had been assaulted didn't want to talk about it. And the NCIS people and the Navy higher ups, their job was to kind of seek them out and pry the complaint out of them, which is a complete inversion of what actually happens and what the actual problem is in the Navy.
That's wild. It's just Jesus Christ. I wanted to ask you as well, there's some movies where it's obvious. There's some, but you wouldn't be surprised at least to learn there's some military involvement. And these are sort of like the big blockbusters with the equipment that you see. But then there's some other, like, I guess, let's say TV shows that I'm surprised, like Extreme Makeover, for example. Like, I'm sort of surprised by just how widespread these relationships are, even on shows that you wouldn't expect them to be.
Yeah, as scholars, we looked first at war films, like this is obviously a war film phenomenon. And, only about 10% of the kinds of contractual relationships that the military enters into with producers have to do with what we'd instantly recognize as a war film. And that was one of the surprising things for me. You look through all these documents, and especially, in the last 20 years, there's a lot more TV, a lot more video games, and a lot more, especially reality TV. Talk shows, stuff like that. So you have like shout outs to, military personnel in the audience, or cooking shows, a lot of cake shows that feature military people. Extreme Makeover or Home Edition is a big one for a while. So they really got their hands in all kinds of pies. The spread in terms of genre, from talk shows to game shows to cooking shows is really stunning.
Wow, that is really stunning. Well, thankfully, Dr. Roger Stahl, we have your book, Militiatainment, Inc., and also the documentary that you're the director of, Theaters of War, to help take us deeper into all of this. And we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Rania?
It's really incredible. Like, American cultural hegemony when it comes to cinema and when it comes to even TV shows is so widespread, and it does make a difference around the world and how the world sees the U.S. Even if they know that the U.S. policies towards their country might not be great, they have this idea that America is really great because, like, they watch Friends or something, or they like the Marvel movies or whatever. But it really is amazing when you see just how insidious all of this is, where just the tentacles are everywhere. I mean, I didn't even realize, like, when you have those shout outs on like talk shows to like, here's a military father who just came back. Yeah. It's like planted there that's crazy.
It is crazy. It is. It's deep. It's deeper than I would have thought. I would not have expected Extreme Makeover Home Edition to be in that space. Wow. It just makes you wonder the stuff the obvious ones, like if you watch NCIS, it's like so obvious, that they're trying to give you a narrative. I mean, but maybe not, as you pointed out, to the layperson. It's very obvious to me, but like, they just rolled out a new one, NCIS Sydney, in Australia. And of course, the very first scene of the very first episode, it's like immediately about China. And it's just like, oh, wow, whoever could have predicted that? But also the thing that these shows do very well is they have very diverse cast. They're focused on teamwork, the relationships between people. So it's also embedded in a way that does make it not only more innocuous, but I think a little easier to accept, because also that sort of the way it's confronting you is not with some of the more sort of odious stereotypes that are out there. But anyway, that's that, and we'll leave that there. Well, let's move on to the issue that I think is on so many of our minds constantly, all day, every day, and that's the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the overall ethnic cleansing of Palestinians all across the lands of historic Palestine, and of course the ongoing movement in solidarity with the Palestinian people that has arisen, and that I'm sure many people watching this have been participating in. But we are very, very happy to be joined here on the show once again by Omar Baddar, who is a Palestinian-American political analyst based in Washington, D.C. Omar, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's always good to be with you guys. How are you?
as my good friend Jared Ball says, about as well as can be expected in these sorts of times.
Yep. Certainly, the world apart. It's the best we can do.
Yes. I wanted to start with the story from the Lancet about the potential death toll, future death toll, direct and indirect deaths, 186,000 plus. Who exactly knows? Which is another point they were making, and it almost. I don't know, maybe for us, this was a story that hit hard. It seemed like it was everywhere, as all over our social media feeds. But a friend of mine pointed out to me, she was like, oh, I haven't heard about that. And I said, oh, really? And she's like, yeah, I didn't really see it at all. And it just seems so amazing that despite all of the controversy we had, you remember very well, Omar, about whether or not the Gaza Ministry of Health could be trusted. And we had to go through 3 weeks, of people questioning what it was or what it wasn't, New York Times, Washington Post. And then now we have this study from the most prestigious medical journal on earth, and it's like crickets.
Yeah, it's incredibly stunning. And you look at, so many comparisons, right? Also with the bombing of the hospital in Ukraine and the sheer contrast in the way the media deals with it, with the way our politicians talk about it. And yes, absolutely. With this Lancet, the article that came out there, the estimate is incredibly credible. It's quite clear from the very beginning that whatever estimate that we have coming out of Gaza is most likely a very severe undercount, given the fact that the sheer destruction of infrastructure in Gaza, the destruction of hospitals, the databases where these kinds of counts are kept up. What's happening in Gaza is complete and total erasure. So you would expect that there would be an undercount because it's almost impossible for any authorities existing there to be able to get to all the areas they need to and to get an accurate count. You add to that the fact that 35% of buildings in Gaza have been completely obliterated. And there are estimates that put it at about 10,000 people who might be missing under the rubble of those destroyed buildings. And then you add on top of that, the thing that was really emphasized in this Lancet article, indirect deaths as a result of this genocide. When you completely obliterate the health care system and there is no food and there is no water, and you can think of all the preventable deaths, had people been just able to go get a checkup and get something resolved that they can't anymore, there is no question that the death toll is significantly higher and is going to continue mounting even when this genocide is ultimately ended. And frankly, they used the words conservative estimate when they put it at 186,000. So I think it's very, very likely that the numbers are going to be horrifying once this all comes to an end and we actually get to see an accurate count and talk about Gaza's ability to sustain life. And the thing that I think is worth emphasizing here is that it all fits precisely into the stated objective that Netanyahu laid out. They laid out unachievable goals. They said they're going to defeat Hamas militarily. They're going to free the hostages militarily. Obviously, those things have not worked. It's been 9 months. They can't even come close to achieving those goals. But the real goal, the one they've alluded to on multiple occasions, and Netanyahu was quoted saying, is they want to, quote, thin the population of Gaza down to a minimum. Those were Netanyahu's words. And that is precisely what they're doing. They would like to completely eliminate Palestinian existence in Gaza. And if they can't completely, quote unquote, finish the job, they would like to just thin the population down to a minimum. And they're doing that through this massive slaughter, through this campaign of starvation. And, who knows, they might be potentially even more blunt with that policy, which is effectively being carried out on the ground and hinted at, that could become more explicit if Netanyahu gets his wish and gets a Trump as president, who is promising that, describing Biden's embrace of Israel's genocide as being too anti-Israel and promising to do even worse. It's an incredibly ugly and horrific situation. It's difficult to find the words to really convey how disgusting and appalling it is that we live in a context that's allowing this to continue and where people are competing about making it worse, not putting an end to it in our political system.
Mm-hmm.
Ahmad, I remember back just after October 7th, you and I had an exchange very briefly. And I remember you messaging me and saying you were very concerned what Israel would unleash on Gaza after this. And I think that what we've witnessed over the last 9 months is something none of us could have ever imagined could happen, largely because it's at this point, they're shooting for fun. They're like really getting enjoyment out of it. And to what Eugene was saying about the fact that this Lancet story got very little, if any, coverage in mainstream US media, Another thing that there's been radio silence about is the Israeli lies about October 7th, specifically one that was just confirmed as a pretty big lie. And that is Israel actually, we don't know how many, but Israel was responsible for the deaths of some of its own citizens on October 7th with the Hannibal Directive. We saw this pretty big piece in Haaretz a few days ago, essentially confirming what had already been reported by some Israeli media and some independent media outlets in the U.S. About the Hannibal Directive. I'm just curious if, your thoughts on, first of all, that piece and what the significance of it is, and also the fact that still, these editors at these major American media outlets get up every day and they read the Israeli media. They saw that report. I have no doubt in my mind they all saw that report. I have seen, and I could be wrong because I haven't checked in the last few hours. So maybe the New York Times just did a big piece about it. I doubt it. But I haven't seen any American mainstream media outlets cover this pretty explosive story.
Yeah, it's deception by omission is what we experience in U.S. media very frequently. And from the get-go, what we saw, frankly, I don't think this is breaking news in the sense that anybody who was paying attention, this was very, very clear. We all understood that this had happened. It was very clear from the statements of Israeli eyewitnesses who had testified to what they had seen, primarily Israelis firing at them, the Israeli military firing at them, and about the fact that, if you remember the estimate from October 7th, initially the Israeli government said that it was 1,400 Israelis who had been killed, and then later on revised that number down to 1,300, then 1,200, and then 1,100 something. And then the explanation that they put out for why they're revising those numbers down is because they were dealing with bodies that were so charred they could not tell who was Palestinian and who was Israeli. And so the obvious question is, if you've got all these charred bodies and you don't know who they are, who set them on fire? How did they actually die and end up in that condition? And it is quite obvious that you can only cause that damage with really heavy munitions that the Hamas fighters who crossed over did not have on them. These are helicopter gunships and tank shells and so on that are causing that kind of damage. And so it was very clear that it had happened. And all that's different now is that we finally have a leading Israeli publication putting out the information that anybody who was paying attention would have already noticed. And it fits into the broader campaign of disinformation and deception that Israel engaged in the aftermath of October 7th, lying about beheaded babies, lying about pregnant women being opened up, lying about the scale of sexual assault allegations, pretending that there was a directive handed out to Hamas fighters in writing about raping as many women as possible and all that stuff. It was all to make a situation that frankly is a crime already. There's no denying it, that, Hamas fighters and other factions that crossed over did commit atrocities. That much is undeniable. But it was not enough to say that they had committed atrocities. They had to make those atrocities as inflammatory as possible. They had to bring those numbers up to as high a number as they possibly could, all in order to justify what Israel had intended to do. And Israel did not merely intend to respond by killing a few Palestinians here or there. They intended to respond in the fashion that we're actually witnessing, the complete erasure of Palestinians. They are engaging in complete genocidal violence and a campaign of starvation where we're watching literally dozens of children who have already died as a result of being starved to death by the Israeli government. And the only way you can make people seem indifferent is not even the word, to kind of find it somehow excusable or turn a blind eye to it, is to create so much visceral animosity and hatred towards Palestinians that you allow for something like that to actually unfold without people objecting the way they're supposed to. Thankfully, it has not worked. The world is outraged. The world, everywhere that you go, even in the United States, a country in which the media wall to wall essentially provides an Israeli narrative about everything that is happening, portrays Israel as the protagonist in this so-called conflict, portrays Palestinians as the adversaries, they are the antagonists. And even in that kind of media climate, Israel's atrocities have been so horrific that the majority of Americans, overwhelming majority, opposes what is unfolding, wants to see a ceasefire. A majority of Democrats and Biden voters are describing what Israel is doing as a genocide. You just can't hide the scale of these atrocities. But clearly, what Israel had succeeded at least in the early days, is give an overly inflammatory portrayal of what unfolded on October 7th as a way of buying some time to carry out the genocide that they are currently unfolding, thinking that they would have been able to achieve more significant goals earlier. But they are proven to be completely unsuccessful. The only thing they have accomplished, if you can call that an accomplishment, is the complete and total devastation of the civilian population in Gaza.
No, I think those are extraordinarily important points. And, it brings me to another point here. And it actually reminds me of something that Netanyahu said back in 1989, actually, that I remember I read shortly after the Tiananmen Square incident in China. And he spoke in the Knesset and he said, we made a huge mistake. When this was happening, we should have expelled all the Palestinians because the world wouldn't have been paying attention. And I was thinking about that the other day when I was looking at some of the devastation in the West Bank after an IDF operation. And it almost, the level of just extreme sheer atrocity happening in Gaza, I feel has created a situation to where, I don't know if unprecedented is the right word, but this extraordinary attempt to accelerate the land grabs and the destruction of the Palestinian community and arresting so many people on the West Bank to really, as the Israelis love to say, impose facts on the ground, which feels like another side of this story that it's obviously being touched on somewhat and by some people, but it seems like an even more pernicious aspect of what's happening, if we can even get more pernicious, that they're using so much of the focus around what the crimes they're committing in Gaza to actually accelerate what's happening in the West Bank, that I think to the world community and media sometimes then seems comparatively tame and thus gets less coverage.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And we've never seen the rate of the killing that we're witnessing in the West Bank right now in literally decades. More than 500 Palestinians being killed in the past few months in the West Bank is a pretty significant number. And a good chunk of it, not just Israeli military operations, but also Israeli settlers who are running rampant in the West Bank without any accountability, attacking Palestinian families, setting Palestinian orchards on fire, destroying Palestinian homes. You have a scale of impunity right now where you have a settler population that is running wild, carrying out pogroms against the native Palestinian population in the West Bank, and the world is largely turning a blind eye to it. And it's ultimately the West Bank is of more strategic and religious significance for Israel. So that's really the land that they're even more interested in holding on to and taking over completely than Gaza, for that matter. Gaza is to Israel basically is primarily a burden. They see it as a significant population center of Palestinians. They wish they could just cut Gaza off and send it over into the sea. In the case of the West Bank, that is definitely land that they want. There's, the region is not particularly resourceful when it comes to water, but there are significant water aquifers in the West Bank. There are a lot of major cities in the West Bank that have significant religious significance for a lot of settlers that live in the West Bank. And so that is an area that Israel is very much interested in taking over. And what has always been an ethnic cleansing in slow motion, that is their standard policy in the West Bank, is now being carried out at a much more accelerated rate. And it's happening precisely because the world is distracted. And you see it in they just had the most significant land grab also that they've had in decades just announced in the West Bank. And they're portraying it as a reaction to the world recognizing Palestinian statehood, to other people kind of objecting to Israeli policies. But don't kid yourself. Israeli policy, with or without any kind of world recognition of Palestinians or any of criticism of Israeli policies, is the continued colonization of the West Bank. And, it's not much of leverage when you say, we're going to carry out colonization in slow motion, but if you criticize us, we're going to speed it up. What you really need in that situation is meaningful intervention to put an end to it. That means real consequences on Israel. It's not enough to say that we recognize Palestinian rights or self-determination or Palestinian rights to their land or all that stuff. Recognition is great. Certainly it's welcome. But in the face of an entity that is so deeply racist and anti-Palestinian and violent, being armed by the world's most significant superpower, that's a dynamic that is not going to lead to anything positive unless the world takes a stand. And if you're afraid to confront Israel and you're afraid to confront the United States, you're afraid to kind of try to intervene in any meaningful way, there's a much simpler option. Simply end your relationship with Israel. Don't deal with them. You can simply boycott, divest, and not have anything to do with a country that is engaging in that kind of behavior. That is the bare minimum. So if confronting the United States and Israel feels like too heavy a burden, all we're asking for, all Palestinians are asking for, is that people not be complicit in that crime, isolate Israel, make sure it is treated like the pariah state that it is, and that it can't have normal relations with anyone in the world. until they start treating Palestinians like equal human beings. That is the bare minimum. And to live in a world in which so many people object to Israeli policies and criticize, and yet they're not willing to take that minimal stance, I think has been incredibly disappointing. And it's a level of hypocrisy that really ought to be called out when you look at how they react to other human rights abusers around the world and the sanctions they impose on them and so on.
Well, as always, Omar, we appreciate you helping bring clarity to all of these important issues. Omar Baddar, Palestinian-American political analyst, thank you so much for your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Rania?
I mean, I don't even know what to say anymore because, I mean, I don't know how many more kids with their heads blown off like need to be on people's social media feeds. I shouldn't even put that on people. I guess it's just like I've never hated our leadership more than I do right now. I just like don't even know how they can get up every day and go to work in the halls of Congress, for example, and not scream about what's happening in Gaza. And instead, what do? They justify it or they ignore it. It's sick. It's so sick.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%. I mean, obviously, when you look back in history, look, the way we look back on people who supported slavery, now it's like, oh, this was so terrible. Then people said, oh, well, listen, slavery, this, that, and the third, all the justifications, everything like that. And that's why one of my favorite quotes that has come out of this moment with the Palestinian Solidarity Movement is people saying, you're asking what you would do during slavery. You're doing it now, right? So like the people who are standing up and fighting back are the people who are standing up, who would have been standing up and fighting back then. The people who are complicit, the politicians, the others, no matter what they say, no matter what they think, they are the ones who would have been standing with the slave owners. So the moral rot at the heart of the United States political establishment couldn't be any more clear, quite frankly. I mean, this is just a terrible situation. Well, we're going to move forward here to another situation in the region that has some bearing on this, but some bearing on many different issues, and that is the Iranian presidential election, the second round of which just concluded last Friday, I believe it was. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again to sort through all the implications of that by Mazda Majidi, who is an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Mazda, thank you so much for being back with us.
Hi, Eugene. Great to be here.
Well, great to have you, did we lose Mazda? Oh, there we go. Got you back. I don't know if this was a shock result or not a shock result in terms of the election. I guess there's different takes on that. But nonetheless, Mr. Peshkanian, I believe it is, please correct my pronunciation there, has become the president. He's sort of said as being from the reformist camp, but I guess maybe just give us a sense, Mazda, of who this gentleman is, what his political background is in that sense. Because I think you hear conservative, you hear reformist, and it's thrown around in the media, but what does that really mean?
Sure. Let me give a little context because the last 6 to 7 weeks haven't really been good for the U.S. Israeli funded satellite channels. If you recall, all these mouthpieces after, May 23rd, when Raisi's helicopter crashed, the former president, there were predictions of people are going to be celebrating in the streets and it's going to be the Islamic Republic is going to be destabilized. Then sure enough, as it's articulated in the Constitution, the Islamic Republic held elections within 6 weeks. Actually, they did it within 5 weeks. And there was the first round of the presidential elections with 6 candidates. Of those 6, the 2 top vote getters, assuming that no one gets more than 50% in the first round, which was the case here, the 2 top vote getters went to a second round, which was immediately the following Friday. So, of course, people didn't celebrate in the street after Raisi's death. There were millions of people who basically participated in rallies and marches, honoring the memory of Raisi. And in the first round of the elections, there was a 40% participation. And so then the following Friday, there was about 50% participation. And the 2 main candidates that were the top vote getters in the first round were Masoud Pezeshkian and Jalili. And Pezeshkian won comfortably. It wasn't a landslide, but he won by about 3 million more than Jalili, and he was elected president. You're right, Eugene. It wasn't that much of a surprise, but given the way that the elections were portrayed in Iran, in that sense, the process went very smoothly. I want to say Pezeshkian, as you said, Eugene, is considered to be part of the reformist camp. But at the same time, he is considered sort of a moderate centrist reformist. And Raisi was considered to be part of the principlist meaning people who adhere to the principles of the Islamic Revolution. In the West media, they call them conservatives. And I don't think the term conservative is very accurate. But in any case, Raisi was a centrist principlist. So this is not going to be a major change from the previous one. The fact that a reformist got elected is not that much of a shock. In fact, most of the presidents elected the last few rounds have been from the reformist camp: Rafsanjani, Khatami, and Rouhani. So that's not a shock either. But anyway, right now, so he's been elected. He hasn't taken office yet. There's a caretaker government right now in charge. And for that reason, the Iran's financial markets have settled down, and there's been, quite a bit of stability there.
I think it's really interesting, by the way, that the presidential elections in Iran coincided with the U.S. presidential debate between Biden and Trump. And I mean, the U.S. media actually was at a disadvantage. It was harder for them to try to delegitimize, I guess, the Iranian elections when our elections so far before November are already a disaster. So I just thought that was like kind of an interesting juxtaposition. But all that's to say, I think it was Anthony Blinken came out and basically said that it doesn't matter that a reformist won. The U.S. still doesn't care and doesn't think Iran's elections are fair. And will still treat Iran in the way that it does. But I do think it speaks to something in the sense that in Iran, just because the so-called reformist candidate won, that doesn't change Iran's relationship with the resistance axis. That is a pretty consistent trend, no matter basically who's president, because, can you explain that? Can you explain why, I guess, Iran's support for the resistance axis, and actually its leadership in the resistance axis, I should say, won't be changed by a presidential election?
Rania, that is exactly right, and it's very important. I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, for one thing, Pezeshkian, shortly after being elected, actually very clearly stated that Iran's support for the resistant movements in Hamas and in Hezbollah and against the illegitimate state of Israel will not change. So he very specifically said that. But even if he had not said that, the political establishment and the institutions are pretty complicated. It's not a simple thing. The president doesn't make all the decisions. There's a parliament or majlis that makes the decisions. There's an expediency council. There's a Council of Guardians, and there's, of course, the Supreme Leader Khamenei. So even if the president somehow wanted to end Iran's support for the people of Gaza or for the resistant movements in the region, oh, by the way, he also mentioned the Houthis in Yemen will continue, Iran will continue to support them and all oppressed peoples and movements representing them. So even if Pezeshkian somehow wanted to end all of that, that would not, there's too many levers of power that would have prevented doing that. We have to keep in mind that, the support of Iran for the Palestinian people has continued through several administrations, really since the time of the 1979 revolution. And it hasn't changed whether there's a reformist or a principlist as the president. Not only that, let me just add to that is that a lot of the major decisions in terms of foreign policy are made at least under the supervision of the office of the Supreme Leader Khamenei. So there's no way, even though that was the last propaganda line that they could come up with, that, oh, he's going to challenge the Islamic Republic or things like that. The reality is that this does not signify major changes. So for that reason, I guess the last thing, just today I ran into this line, which was pretty interesting, is that 50% of the population boycotted the elections. And, this is very interesting because, no country in the world gets 100%. In fact, 50% is about average for US presidential elections. And I had never heard it spun the other way around, with 50% having boycotted. But the fact is that the opposition, which, by the way, does exist and wanted to boycott the election, definitely wanted low numbers. But there were those who did not participate in the elections for that reason. But there's several others that, we can get to if we have time.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question. And actually some people who boycotted the last presidential election I saw came off the fence and said vote for the current president now. But I actually wanted to speak to that, Mazda, because it's interesting to me because obviously there's an element of management to what happens in the Iranian elections. But the idea that there's no debate whatsoever, I thought was totally belied. This is just me speaking now, and looking at the presidential debates in this election. Now, of course, there's certain candidates, people think there should be more people in there, but some of the things that just stood out to me to just sort of speak to this. One was the issue of dress code, the dress code for women, and that all of the candidates actually said they were against any form of sort of compulsory activity on that front. They had different views on it, but I thought that was notable. Also, the issue of quote unquote filtering, or how the internet is managed and all those pieces. All the candidates saying they thought there should be a more open internet environment that's there. I saw Mr. Peskeshian actually went and spoke to some college students who in many ways were very critical and very hostile, and had a very open exchange with them about what was going on in the country, especially corruption and how to address some of those issues, and calling on them to stay in the country, don't leave, and all these different pieces. So I just say all that to say that it seems like this sort of caricature that there's no debate whatsoever and that this is just a totally fake thing just didn't really ring true to me, because it seemed like both for the people voting and non-voting, the sort of issue debates were revolving around what average everyday people on the street feel needs to change in the country.
That's a good point. It is very true, of course, that of the, I think, 80 some people who registered to run for president, the Council of Guardians deemed 6 qualified to run. So with that, that's like the limits of who can get elected, and it's based on past performance, public service, adherence to the principles of the revolution, and all those things. Having said that, there's very lively debates. First of all, the debates, you don't watch them wondering who has the better performance or who gives the best one-liners. There's like intense debates about substantive issues, about issues having to do with people's lives, about the economy, about, just like you said, Eugene, about the hijab and the head coverings, about relations with the West, about how to support the resistance movement in the region and so forth. It's very interesting, and it's a short period. It's pretty intense. But when there were 6 candidates, and later when there were 2, there were debates that were broadcast on TV and watched by probably the majority of the population. And even in the streets and in interviews, I will say this: the range of views and opinions expressed are far greater than what you see in the corporate US media, where you could flip channels 100 times and there's maybe a little tilt towards Biden or Trump or whatever, but the general premise, the general outlook is not significantly different. So yes, there's very lively debates in Iran, in the streets, in buses, at all times, but certainly before presidential elections.
Yeah, Ronnie, go ahead.
Oh, well, I didn't know if you were going to let me.
No, I thought you were going to say something, so I didn't want to cut you off there.
We both took a deep breath at the same time. Well, Mazda, I guess moving forward, as we approach potential second Trump presidency, I'm not suggesting that Biden is somehow amazing on Iran. Obviously, Trump ripped up the nuclear deal and Biden kept it that way. Biden has instituted even more sanctions on Iran since he took over the presidency. However, should Trump come back to office, which if there was an election held today, it seems he would, there is a concern he would reappoint people like Mike Pompeo, for example, who has this very extreme anti-Iran, like Christian nationalist view of, apocalyptic end times, rapture ready stuff he wants to bring about. Then there's the John Bolton type characters. I mean, these people may come back into a Trump administration. So I guess my question is, obviously, regardless of who's president in the U.S. come next year, the tilt will still be anti-Iran. But is there a concern? Are you concerned? What might happen if these extremists come back? And I mean, I'm talking about the people who were the ones who created the situation where General Qasem Soleimani was murdered.
Yes, I mean, I am concerned, Rania, and the fact is that at least since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Iranians have been concerned to some level. In fact, this has gone on for so long that people have been sort of desensitized, because for years and years now, for decades, bombing or invading Iran has been an quote option on the table. So for that reason, I mean, we cannot not take these things seriously. And it is very true that the Trump administration and people like Bolton and Pompeo and others are more hawkish on Iran, even compared to Democrats. Having said that, there are some things that have changed the reality on the ground. Before I go into that, let me just say this. In fact, part of the reason that Pezeshkian received support and won the elections was that he was promoting in the debates, finding ways to reach agreements with the West in hopes that the sanctions will end. Having said that, like if Rania, if Trump gets elected, there's no possibility of an agreement being reached. So it doesn't really matter who's the president of Iran and what concessions they're willing to make. But when I say some realities on the ground have changed, is that, we're kind of seeing that in a different setting with Netanyahu. No matter how hawkish Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and the rest of his cabinet are, the reality on the ground limits how much the IDF, the Israeli military, can do. I mean, they can talk tough, but after nearly a year now, they haven't really done an all-out invasion of Gaza because they know their limits and the abilities of the resistance. Similarly, after the exchange of fire between Iran and Israel, of course, following the assassination of Iranian generals in Syria, what has happened is that Iran now sees itself in a position where it's not just a matter of Israel deciding to eliminate Iran or even the U.S. I'm not suggesting that Iran's military is a match for the U.S. military, but an invasion of Iran by the U.S. would be extremely costly, probably tens of times of what it was for Iraq. So the likes of Bolton and Pompeo and whatever other characters are in the future administration, if Trump gets elected, they can talk tough and they will certainly not loosen up the sanctions, and they may add to them. But again, I don't think anyone in Tehran is overly worried about a direct attack by the U.S. And to add to that, Iran has deeply extended its relationships with China, economic and otherwise, which has in part, softened the blow of the sanctions, particularly with the ability to sell oil to China at high numbers, over 1 million barrels a day.
Well, Mazda, as always, we really appreciate having you here to sort through all this. Mazda Majidi, you are an organizer with the Answer Coalition, among many other superlatives I could add. Thank you so much, as always, for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Great job, you guys. Thank you.
Well, Rania, if you don't object, I'll move into our next guest, who I know is waiting patiently. And that is Dr. Ben Becker, the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, who is joining us to discuss the crisis situation in the Democratic Party, perhaps the nation, given that the president seems to only be functional for 6 hours a day from 10 to 4. Nonetheless, Dr. Ben Becker, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me. I feel like we're going to get a lot of laughs in this segment. Rania's laughing before we've even begun.
Indeed.
Can I tell you why I was laughing? I was going to make a joke about how, I mean, you're the editor in chief, so I'm just letting you know I am now only functional from 10 to 4.
Wow.
Could you imagine telling your boss that? No, but how crazy is that? Sorry, take it. Go ahead, Eugene.
No, I mean, and you are fluent in English, Rania. So
Thank you.
You also, I mean, you work longer than Joe Biden, and you have much greater verbal capacity.
Yeah.
I was just reading up. I think Joe Biden probably qualifies as semi-fluent at this point, which is like, you can hold conversations, but challenged with, I think the definition I saw is challenged with nuanced expressions and complex vocabulary. So the president at this point is, I think, semi-fluent in English.
I think you might be right about that. Well, and we'll continue to see. There's a press conference about the NATO summit. There's an interview with Lester Holt from NBC News all coming up soon. So we'll see how he does there. Anyway, I guess one of my questions here, Ben, is, obviously everything has understandably shifted to the president's capacity, President Biden's capacity, because, I would say most people consider one of the qualifications to be president that you are mentally capable of doing the job. But that being said, even prior to this controversy over his mental capacity, he was already losing. And so, I think now almost it's like something has sort of grown up that like, oh, well, if he was just hadn't had that moment, everything would be fine and he would be winning. Or if they switched to Kamala Harris, everything, or whoever else, everything would be fine and they would just be winning. But it seems like a big piece of the crisis for the Democratic Party isn't just, whether or not Joe Biden is sundowning, but really actually the policies of the Democratic Party vis-a-vis the situation for working class people, the oppressed people of this country, the people who the Democrats depend on for a large number of their votes.
No, absolutely. I mean, even the fact that we started with the jokes, we're not immune to it. I mean, how can you, in a way, not pay attention to the question of mental capacity? And that was the big takeaway from that debate. It was unavoidable. But I think you're 100% right that for all of this discussion, in a way, it can be a distraction. It's sort of like watching a train wreck or watching reality TV or something like that. It's actually not the most important thing for working people. It's not really the important thing for understanding geopolitics. I think it symbolizes something important with respect to the decline of the U.S. empire. And it would be worth talking about how we got here and why is it that the Democrats are so unable to switch horses at this point. How did they even end up with Biden? I think is an interesting question. But yeah, you're right. I mean, ultimately, is what we need a more well-spoken and efficient neoliberal Democrat who wants to go to war with multiple countries and invade them and impose sanctions and do the bidding of Wall Street. I mean, that's not exactly the answer either. In a way, you could even say it's more dangerous. Maybe the working class is actually doing better at this stage. This is how bad the government has become for working class people. Maybe it's actually better to have total incompetence than have people who are very competent at exploiting and tricking you. And I think the crisis in the ruling class right now is that Joe Biden is no longer seen as competent at that. He is no longer able to sort of show the kind, compassionate, competent face for a political and economic establishment that really needs that. It wants to show that. And the fact that it's kind of unthinkable that the face of the empire and the face of Wall Street and corporate America and the institutions would either be Donald Trump or Joe Biden has become quite a horrifying prospect for the ruling class. So it's really an internal ruling class crisis. And I don't think people who are not in the ruling class, which I assume is almost 100% of Breakthrough viewers, that, we shouldn't think about it exactly as our crisis. Our crisis is something much more profound, much more long lasting, and is much harder to get out of. It will require a lot more struggle than just picking a new candidate.
Yeah. And, when we think about distractions, I mean, it really is aggravating to me, and I assume both of you as well, to have so much horror shown at Biden performing terribly. I mean, he did during a debate, more horror than I've seen expressed over Biden's policy in Gaza. That said, there's so many different angles to what's happening right now, and not just the Democratic Party sort of imploding over whether Biden should be the candidate or not. But I think something that's been interesting to watch and sort of stunning is, you have these kinds of like progressive members of Congress who, and this is not to just pick on them for the sake of picking on them, but I think it's a serious issue. You have people like AOC and also Ilhan Omar who talk about they have to get behind the Democratic nominee, no conditions, because we have to defeat Trump, right? Like it's really, really important to defeat Trump, sort of lesser evil talking point. But then obviously Joe Biden in this condition can't defeat Trump. Yet these same people are coming out and saying things that like, okay, I wasn't so surprised to see AOC still back Biden wholeheartedly, even though I was kind of just like, you're lying about him being the best candidate. But even Ilhan Omar came out and said that something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing here, Biden is the best president of our times. And I'm just like, what? I mean, and I know you're not, you don't know exactly why these people are doing this, but like, what explains that from these so-called progressives who claim that they have to support the Democrats because then there's Trump? Like, wouldn't this be the moment to be like, no, we need to replace this guy because he can't win?
Yes, that would be the moment. I mean, there's a logical incoherent aspect to this. Like, if Trump represents fascism and you have to support anyone who will defeat Trump, then, as you just said, ergo, we have to find someone who can beat Trump. That would, you would think, be the logical conclusion, given those sort of stipulations. I think it's exposing really the mafia-like quality of the Democratic Party. And not as the Republican Party is the same way, honestly, both big business parties, where you can't come out against the leader. The leader has tremendous power to punish you, tremendous power to sink your reputation among certain donors and lobbyists, to kill your bills in Congress, to end your career, to end your relationships. It's actually been, I mean, there is just pure cowardice, don't get me wrong, but I mean, some of it has been outright embarrassing. What AOC said, I was like, embarrassed on her behalf almost, and I'm not an AOC supporter. Like, really? She's declaring the matter closed? I mean, why do you have to say that? Ilhan Omar saying he's the best president of our lifetime. These are the same people who are just criticizing the genocide, so to speak, although AOC won't even use that word. But, I mean, the best president in our lifetime, if the best president in our lifetime also wages genocide and can't get any bills passed for the working class, and, has done all these things that have basically demoralized the Democratic Party base, what does that mean about the presidents in our lifetimes, first of all? But secondly, like, if there were ever a time for a facelift, you would say, let's go with someone else. And instead, it sounds like they've all been cowed into submission. Maybe that'll change. In the next few days, you never know. But they're all waiting for who else is going to stick their necks out. And everyone else is like commenting off the record. I mean, there's actually not even I haven't really seen an ounce of bravery from any of them, even from the standpoint of like their own bourgeois self-interest. It really speaks to kind of the back-scratching, horse-trading nature of what goes on in Washington, that more people haven't stood out. 70% of voters say that he's too old, that he doesn't have the capacity, and yet it's like 7 members of Congress. So talk about all the discrepancy between the attitudes of Congress and the attitudes of the people. It's never been clear. And the progressives in the Democratic Party, you'd think, would have an axe to grind here. I mean, this is the point I was making earlier, that Joe Biden only became the Democratic Party nominee in 2020 because the whole establishment united to crush Bernie Sanders. Remember, Joe Biden, this is when he was mentally in good shape, blah, 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 so to speak. He came in 4th in the first 2 primaries in 2020. And Bernie, or actually, I think he came in 3rd in the 3rd primary. It was only when he won in South Carolina that the Democratic Party establishment figures a lot of them dropped their campaigns and united behind Biden to defeat Bernie Sanders, because Bernie was winning 2 of the first 3 races. And so, Joe Biden was someone who has pretty much had a a bad track record of campaigning his whole life. He's never engendered enthusiasm and mobilization. He's always been seen as a right-wing figure within the Democratic Party, very cozy with the Republicans, very cozy with the segregationists, despite his false claims of being a civil rights activist, very hard on in terms of mass incarceration, very close to Wall Street. You know, if the progressives really wanted to make a bid that someone else should lead, his obviously collapse would be the time to do it. Instead, you see them like they're almost out in front of everyone else. In fact, some of the more right-wing Democrats are speaking up more than the progressives. It's actually shameful. And same thing with the AFL-CIO president, sadly, saying the same thing again today, doubling down. We're backing Joe Biden. I mean, you could just say nothing and use this as a moment to sort of get some serious concessions from the Democratic Party. But again, I think it reflects the kind of like extremely authoritarian culture that exists within the Democratic Party and bourgeois politics.
No, I think it's a good point. And I think, my next question leads into that, is it seems like it also reflects the rule of capital, of the capitalist class over the Democrats. Like, to be a Democrat, you have to accept, a certain set of policies, and you can't go beyond that whatsoever, because it just makes no sense to me that you would go with Joe Biden at this point, other than the fact that you just said about Bernie Sanders. Because listen, going back to 2022, because it was after, when Biden gets in, everyone thought he was one term. Then the Democrats defy the typical historical piece. They win the midterm elections in 2022. Then all of a sudden, Biden says he's running for re-election. But at that time, all the way through 2023, the majority, at many times a supermajority of Democrats were telling pollsters they wanted another nominee. But it seems to me, Ben, that they knew they couldn't open it up for the same reason that they had to have Biden to unite against Bernie Sanders. Because if they opened it up, people would be more likely, Democratic voters, to support a candidate who then got into that race against him, putting a more progressive policy forward, saying, Biden did this great, he did that great, we're not against Biden, but we need to go further, we need to do more. As we saw from Build Back Better, we need to, also do more with our Senate candidates and our House candidates. We need to move in a more progressive direction so we can try to implement these changes. We need to pack the Supreme Court, all the things that liberals and progressives have been talking about for the past 4 years, that have 60, 70% majority support amongst all Democrats, that type of person would probably be more likely to have won in that kind of reality. And so I say that just to say, all the so-called progressive leaders, all the labor leaders, of course, all the big donors colluded with the Biden administration to make sure there was no primary. So to me, it says that the power base, as you say, because the presidency can discipline the members, the individuals who are inside of the Democratic Party who are progressives, they want to chair committees. They want to have access to the best vendors. They want to make sure they can have the donors return their calls. The labor unions, I don't know what they want because they don't get anything from the Democrats anyway. I guess they just want to be in the room, so to speak, and allege that they can do something and maybe have Joe shuffle onto a picket line at some point or some other point. So they're getting all, so it's their own individual power base, because to join one of the two major parties, you have to accept that you must play by the rules, which means you can't go outside of the red lines that the big business, the big donors, the billionaires, and the millionaires who really control these campaigns have established.
It's a true mask-off moment in that sense. This whole process. And I think, they're saying, well, look, it's a democracy. The voters already chose Joe Biden. I mean, what a joke. The primaries this season were a pure coronation for Joe Biden. And everyone knew that if they stuck their neck out, they were going to be crushed. Despite Joe Biden saying earlier, as you said, he was a transition president and so forth. Because as you say, the Democratic Party is still based on the same contradiction, that they have essentially a pro-Wall Street, neoliberal, pro-war establishment. And then they have a voting base that wants a lot of progressive change. And you saw a reflection of those demands in the initial legislative packages that Joe Biden proposed in 2021. The American Families Plan, the American Jobs Plan, whatever the problems were with them, you had things like universal childcare, like a mass investment in public schools infrastructure, not a minor issue. Actually, after highways, the number 2 area of public sector infrastructure is public schools. And you know what our public school infrastructure report card says, we get a D plus in the United States. So the public schools that train tens of millions of young people get a D plus. And so it's a pretty common sense thing that, you might need tens of billions of dollars to repair that. That was in the initial plan. Never came to be. The inclusion of dental care and hearing and vision in Medicare for the elderly never came to be. The extended child tax credit never came to be. All these things that you'd think would have been used to prepare for the next election. In other words, if Joe Biden could go out and say, I did X, Y, and Z that helped the working class, even he or any other Democrat wouldn't have any problem with enthusiasm right now, because people have been pretty clear about what they want. The problem they've had for years now is that they never actually wanted to do those things, because that would require taking a serious cut out of corporate profits and really cutting into the power of the ruling class. And so when Joe Manchin, who became their excuse, said, I'm not going to go for that, they all just dropped all that stuff. So now they're running in 2024, not on anything they've done, but again, at just like 2020, just like 2016, their main campaign message is, I'm not the other guy. I'm not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is fascism, blah, blah, blah. So they still have this internal contradiction. And the moment they start to open up the leadership process, it's going to come roaring back. And part of me was even conspiratorially thinking that they knew this all along, the Democratic Party, that they were going to get through the primaries and then let Joe Biden tank, and then in the convention switch to another neoliberal Democrat who could not win an open primary against a progressive challenger. So that it's gotten so bad that I was like thinking in those terms. But now that I see how Joe Biden is reacting, obviously, I don't think there really was a conspiracy, because Joe Biden is seriously holding on. And he is representing the same sort of egotism, arrogance, and individualism that, reminds me of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who held on to the very end when she knew she could have retired. And it's really because of her that Donald Trump got to name a Supreme Court justice, and that took away abortion rights. So all the same people who use these progressive causes to get elected, they don't really care about them. Really what they care about is their own position, and Joe Biden is proving it. And sadly, the whole Democratic Party establishment seems to be proving that these are just talking points for them too. Because if they actually believed what they said, they would obviously pick someone else.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Dr. Ben Becker bringing quite a bit of clarity to the political scene here in the United States. I guess that's why you're the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, because that's what we do all day, every day. So go ahead and hit subscribe on YouTube and the bell so you get the alerts. But thank you so much, sir, for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
And
Thanks.
after 4 p.m.
After 4 p.m. You just got my cutoff. Next time I really want to be on at 3 p.m.
He'll be even sharper.
Indeed.
I like to be home with a hot cup of tea at this time.
Thank you.
Oh, dear. You're welcome.
Well, Rania, before we close here, I want to note this is the 75th anniversary of NATO, of course, and Biden, from the current time we are speaking, about 2 hours from the current time we are doing this recording, will be giving a press conference, which is, people are saying this will show if he's good or if he's not. But outside of that, I think it is, it's a big anniversary. It's a round anniversary. I mean, there's so much that could be said about NATO, but, I just want to say a couple things, and then get your thoughts. I think the lack of any real discussion around what NATO really is in America is a huge crime. It's a war alliance. It's designed to push U.S. unipolar hegemony around the whole world, to isolate countries that the U.S. does not like, to capture the leadership of Europe to make sure that they can't push their own affairs. They're now extending into Asia. They've pushed the issue in Afghanistan and Libya that have destroyed countries around the world. So it's totally fake, but it's important for people, I think, to understand elements of the history. Because when you hear about NATO, they say it's a defensive alliance formed in the first Cold War. Now, of course, the Soviet Union's been gone for some time, so not a lot of people to push back. But I want our viewers to understand it is not, in fact, a defensive alliance. It was not started for defense. It was started for offense against the Soviet Union, because there was never a threat of war. There was never a threat of the Soviet Union invading Western Europe. That was never real, and that's documented. And I want to read you some things because I want to make sure that people understand that history correctly. 1946. Now remember, NATO was founded in 1949. 1946, Secretary of Defense James Forstall, Secretary of Defense, said in his diary that the Soviets would not move towards war at any time. Secretary of Defense, 1946. He also noted shortly after that the U.S. military government of Germany, so the guy who was dealing with the Russians every single day right after World War II when the Allied powers had divided it, said that the Russians did not want war. And just to keep going here, Rania, because we're on a roll, 1946, remember NATO, 1949, General Dwight D. Eisenhower told Forstall, the Secretary of Defense, the Russians would not take, this is a quote, the Russians would not take steps leading to immediate war. And in fact, one of his top generals would say in 1948 that he was confident the Russians didn't want war. And as late as 1952, after NATO had already been formed, Eisenhower's chief of staff at the time told the press publicly, in my mind, there isn't going to be any war. Even George Kennan, the architect of U.S. Cold War policy, said in 1950, a year after the formation of NATO, and he said this to Reader's Digest, a conservative anti-communist publication, that it was, quote, hardly likely that the Soviets were, quote, charting a course for an early military onslaught on the Western world. So there was never a threat of a Soviet invasion of Western Union. There was always an attempt by the United States to try to make sure that the governments of Western Europe did not become what you might call politically pluralist. Because what was happening is that you had the resistance to the Nazis that had existed during World War II, which was very broad politically, from communists, on the left, to people like de Gaulle, very conservative people on the right in France. And coming out of the war, the communists especially, also other left-wing forces, had a lot of support in the population in countries like Italy, countries like France, places like Yugoslavia, places like Greece, and the people there wanted to have governments that they wanted to elect democratically that would probably have all these political forces in hand. And some of them, like Italy, the communists probably would have won. That's why the United States in 1947 started undermining Greece, because they knew the same thing would happen. And they needed to create an alliance that would sort of freeze things, so they manipulated the policies. And I want to read you one more quote that's important here, because an issue that heavily led to this, if you get into the things about NATO and you're reading about this, they'll say, well, what about what happened in Germany and the Soviets trying to divide Germany? Well, the Soviets, Stalin, there's many things we could say about Stalin. He wanted to unify Germany. And the U.S. did not want to unify Germany. And it's on the record. One of the key policymakers of the United States said in their discussions about Germany, the difficulty under which we labor, this is a quote, the difficulty under which we labor is that in spite of our announced position, we really do not intend to accept German reunification. So from the very beginning, the idea of NATO, of a U.S.-anchored military alliance that went along with the Marshall Project and the early formations of what would become the European Community and then the European Union, was designed to make sure that there was a buffer zone in Western Europe where even if the people themselves wanted to vote it in, even if the people were for it, even if they were going to cast their ballots democratically, just like George Washington talked about, at the Battle of whatever, that they would not allow that, that they would form a whole separate set of governments, that they would form military alliances and political alliances to shut out the communists and to shut out anyone else in society who said, why don't we try to work together? And we had World War I, we had World War II. Why don't we build what they used to call a common European home where we can all live together from the UK to the Urals, and we can have some form of modus vivendi. All our governments won't be the same. All our ideology won't be the same, but we can reunify Germany. We can reunify our continent in a way that can prevent another world war. But the U.S. said no, because they wanted to be the preeminent power. As they were talking about, they wanted it to be the American century. They were openly saying that all of them, the top U.S. business people, politicians, that they wanted to dismantle the old colonial world. They wanted to get rid of the British and the French Empire, and they wanted to take over. And they wanted to dominate the old colonial powers. They wanted to dominate the global South so that they could increase their profits, increase their corporations, and increase everything. But the Soviet Union was an obstacle to that because A, many countries wanted to be communist countries and socialist countries, and B, there were countries who wanted to have good relations with them, even if they didn't want to be communist or socialist countries, and they operated as a roadblock to the United States being able to have this massive control over the world, the so-called American century in the post-World War II era. So they created a fake threat. They created a fake threat of an invasion from the Soviet Union. They manipulated the politics of German reunification in order to really sort of draw the Soviets into a more aggressive posture so that they could then go on from that and set up these military alliances that would allow them to capture Europe. As you can see today, why do all the European leaders just cut their own throats of their economy and destroy their economy for the war in Ukraine? Because the U.S. has spent every waking moment from 1943, quite frankly, up until today, creating a totally neutered, captured, mentally enslaved leadership through entities like NATO in order to make sure that they maintain control of the world. That's why they put it in the first national defense strategy after the end of the Cold War, that one of the key factors was to keep control of Western Europe. That's how Mr. Wolfowitz wrote it in the original document, because they understood that any other power center that says maybe the U.S. shouldn't be able to unilaterally decide what every other country does at every other time and force its own companies and its own interests onto everyone, no matter what the costs are, that kind of power or government anywhere else in the world is dangerous. That's why they're trying to encircle China. That's why they're moving NATO towards China. A lot of it was accusing China of helping Russia in the war in Ukraine. You've got Prime Minister Kishida in Japan saying he wants to bring NATO alliances more into Asia. This is what it's all about. It's all about control. It's not about defense. It never has been. The history has been manipulated. It's honestly unbelievable how clear the information is, how readily available it is, and yet it never enters into the mainstream media. So I'm sorry that's a little bit of a rant, Rania, but I think it's very important for people to understand the construction of NATO, which goes along with the construction of the national security state, the establishment of the Pentagon, National Security Council, the CIA, and others, is all part of one drive that also went with the Taft-Hartley anti-union law, that also went with the role of the Marshall Plan. It was all one drive to turn the 20th century into the American century, which means the century of the American capitalist and imperialist. And now they want the 21st century to continue to be the American century, the century of the American capitalist and imperialist. And they're afraid that it looks like it could be the Asian century, maybe the Asian African century, and they're doing everything they possibly can to stop it. And NATO is their wedge. NATO is their vehicle. It's a war alliance. It's not a defensive alliance. It's an imperial alliance, and it's designed to help them control the world.
Oh, I think that's all necessary to break down. That was a very fantastic explanation of what NATO is and what it continues to stand for. And it really is incredible, because it's like we live in some upside down world where if you are reading the New York Times or watching CNN all the time, and then you're watching what Eugene just broke down, you would be like, wait, this sounds like two completely different entities. Because NATO is promoted as this like freedom, this organization that is trying to just guarantee freedom and save Europe and America and the civilized world against the Russian and Chinese barbarians. And I do think it's important to recognize the way NATO is still being used, because that history is important to understand that, like you said, same reasons for its existence today, to try to crush any power that seeks to forge a path independent, not even antagonistic to, just independent of U.S. interests. And that's why, of course, China needs to be attacked. That's why you see an encirclement of China, and that's why you see an attempt, and there goes my electricity, but that's why you see an attempt. That's why you see an attempt to turn NATO into an anti-China alliance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I take responsibility for that, because I told you not to get your backup power ready. So that's on me. But we could probably blame NATO for that too. We can certainly
I was going to say.
We can certainly blame the division of the world by imperial powers, multiple times over, of which Lebanon has been one of the number one victims, along with Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and others. But that's another story for another time. I think that brings us to the end of our show here. The sanctions declared end of our show. But nonetheless, It's been fantastic as always. Want to give a big shout out to all of our guests, of course. Want to give a big shout out to everybody who watched and who viewed. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Rania, even though you're there in the dark, we can still see you. So what do you want to leave our listeners with here towards the end?
Well, I want to remind people that we are an independent media outlet. We're quite small. We're nonprofit. So we are able to sustain ourselves based on your generosity. So if you are able to, if you have the means and you have not already, please become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news for as little as $5 a month, though you are welcome to give much more than that. You can access all kinds of cool perks, including merch, including content that is only available to members. And most importantly, you can help keep us sustainable, thriving, growing. So please do become a member of Breakthrough News if you can. And also make sure to subscribe and to smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Smash that like
Well,
button.
for Rania, for myself, for our whole Breakthrough News team, thanks to everyone, and we will see you next time.